my natural inclination was to assume that cyberbullying really wasn't that big a deal. And there's a reason for that. Throughout history, when a new technology has come along, there's been this moral panic that built up around it. This goes back all the way to the earliest of technologies, but particularly for electric and then electronic technologies, it was always seen as something that was going to be harmful, and especially harmful to the kids. For example, there was the claim that the sound of the wind over the telegraph lines was really the ghosts that were trapped in that electronic system, that it was basically a demonic technology. That during the Nickelodeon period, there was this idea that we were turning our children into monsters by allowing them to see movies. And certainly in the modern day, the Communications Decency Act was a reaction to what people saw as the internet as being kind of being for porn, right? That the pornography of the internet was going to take over, and it was going to be, our children were going to be exposed to a great deal of pornography. And if not that, then they were going to be exposed to predators who were going to snatch them from us because they can find out about them online. Of course, like any myth, all of these have a small kernel of truth to them. Maybe not the demonic line so much, but most of them have some kind of small kernel of truth. Certainly people did get abducted, tracked down and tracked down online and chatted and developed as a potential victim and then snatched. This does happen. It did happen and does happen, but it is extraordinarily infrequent. By far and away, most abuse of children comes not from some random stranger on the internet, but from a family member. And so it's not true that this never happens, but the idea that it's a major kind of danger is a myth. And so having been exposed to all of these moral outrages, and I particularly think of the children and how it can affect them, my natural inclination is to assume that cyberbullying is the same, but it's not. So let's talk a little bit about what cyberbullying isn't before we delve into it in more depth. Cyberbullying is bullying. So maybe that's why we can dismiss it, right? We've always had bullying, and cyberbullying is not a separate thing. If it were a separate thing, then the claim that you could just keep your kids offline and they'd be safe would be a reasonable claim, right? Especially early on, people would say, well, these kids are stupid. If they don't want to be bullied, they just don't go online. I think if you've been online as a young person, you recognize that cutting yourself off from online interactions is not going to save you from bullying. It may even make it worse, because the bullies are still going to be talking online, even if you don't happen to be there. What people don't understand is, again, this idea of a separation between the virtual world and the real world never really existed, and certainly doesn't exist now. It's something that is a serious problem. And it's a serious problem because, unlike some of these other putative problems, not only do creepers online, are kids mostly able to handle creepers online, but they're also able to, there was in part this truth, which is children now are exposed to pornography at a much younger age, but they also, by and large, and this isn't everybody, but by and large, have managed to develop their own tools to handle both creepers online and handle, encountering pornography online. More can be done on both fronts, but the kids are all right in that case. The kids are not all right for cyberbullying. Bullying was always a problem. It probably is being more recognized as a problem now because of the cyber element, but it's a serious problem. Most kids have been cyberbullied. Most kids have been bullied online at this point. And of those incidences of bullying, only about 1 in 10 are actually reported to adults, to parents, to people in school. Mostly people have to deal with it themselves, which wouldn't be too much of a problem since they are already dealing with some of these other issues online. But it's very difficult to deal with this particular one. If you look at the people who commit suicide, they are far more likely to have been bullied online than their peers who do not. So, this is actually an epidemic at that level. It's creating serious psychological harm to kids and serious physical harm as well. So it's something we need to do something about. So what is different between the old bullying and the new cyberbullying? Well, one is that it's 24/7. I was bullied as a kid. I mean, who wouldn't bully me? But I was bullied as a kid. But I could go home. It was only going to last the length of the school day. People might try to catch me after school, but once I was home, I was home. That was my sort of a safe space that other people couldn't invade. I could interact with parents. I had other places other than school I could go and find people like me. There's no one like me, but find people more like me. So that used to be a solution for lots of people. This was also a time when you could hop on your bike and leave campus and get out of there, right? So you had an escape. But just like I can't escape from work at this point because I have a cell phone and can always be reached, our spatial division of labor, our spatial division of activities has been broken down by a pervasive networking. So, on the one hand, if I'm at the supermarket, I can pick up the phone and call my spouse and say, what did I forget that I need to get here? And even though she's at work, she can still pick up the phone. Way back in the day, there was this expectation you didn't take personal calls at work. There are still some job categories where that's true, but for most people at this point, it's not uncommon for you to talk to people on the phone that are, you do private stuff, that's family stuff that's also at work, because the other side of that coin is that work feels like they can always get at you when you're at home. You don't have separate home time. Certainly people have tried to structure that a bit, but generally speaking, the technology enables this interpenetration of public and private life. And really the cutting edge of that is cyberbullying, because, if you can get at your victim wherever they are, they really don't feel like there's a place they can go. And as I said, just turning off the phone or turning off the computer is not enough to escape, because it still is happening there, right? And you can't cut yourself off from that and not also cut yourself off from the kinds of social support you could use as a counter to that. So if you shut that off, in some way the terrorists have won. If you divorce yourself from that, from the online world, that doesn't end the bullying in physical spaces, first of all, and second of all, it divorces you from potentially the people that could support you, as well as from the bullies. So that's different, right? It can get at you. The other part of it, though, is that it is now more persistent. That is to say, although there are certain kinds of technologies, and we'll talk about these in a second, platforms where it's harder to collect evidence. Before, if someone was bullying you, they would also likely gaslight you. If you were stupid enough to go to a parent or to a teacher and talk about this bullying, often these people were very good at manipulating adults and making it sound like you were crazy. You weren't being bullied. You were just hypersensitive or something, right? Well, now people, and we have some very unfortunate cases where they've been able to go back and look at the texts and look at posts and things and see how people have affected the person who is being bullied. There is not a paper trail, but an electronic trail that follows this along. So maybe that's a small advantage, which is there's at least the opportunity to track this in a way that often was much more difficult in the past, because if you weren't being constantly monitored, when the teacher left the room or when you were walking home from school, these were all opportunities for people to bully you without any record of it having happened. And so those kinds of spaces have been limited to a much greater degree because you can record what's going on. So that's maybe a good side of it that makes it different, that makes cyberbullying different. Another part is, and we've talked about this perhaps in other contexts as well, that it is easier to feel less empathy when the person isn't there physically. So not having to see the face of the person you're bullying and knowing that they can't see yours allows you to be much crueler than you would be otherwise. I mean, this goes all the way back to the Milgram experiment, right? If you can't see the person you're shocking, even if you can hear them, you're still more likely to do it. If you can see them, it's far less likely. So being in physical proximity with someone, there is going to be some level where you kind of say, okay, this is too much. Even for me, even for the best bully in the world, I'm not going to keep crushing this person after I've already crushed them, because I can kind of see what I've done. And even if I don't feel ashamed of it, I know that perhaps unless I'm completely a sociopath, I know that there's some level where I need to stop. And online, you never get that opportunity for that empathy, or it's much harder to get that opportunity for the empathy. So cyberbullying allows bullies to go further than they might otherwise choose to go in another environment, or it might not be limited by people around who say, no, you should stop this, right? That it's just even if the bully themselves isn't willing to step in, the crowd might be willing to say, okay, that's enough, right? You've gone too far. So all of those make it slightly different. So what do we do about this? And I think we need to start by saying the technical solution, which is again this standard sort of technocratic approach to social problems. Well, these technologies have caused cyberbullying. That's not true, first of all, but they've caused cyberbullying, so we can find technologies that can remove it. We have the brightest men on the job. They will engineer a solution that will get rid of cyberbullying, and along with it, all bullying, and we will all live together in perfect harmony. No, that's not going to happen. Not alone, at least. There's different layers that we have to think about. At the top layer, we need to really think about the culture of bullying. Bullying does not happen solely in the school context. And even in the school, it's often represented outside of the peer-to-peer side. Admittedly, schooling in the way that we've structured it, which is putting all people of the same age group in the same place, kind of lends itself to this kind of bullying. Although even if you open it up a little, often the older people will bully the younger people. So that doesn't necessarily solve the problem if you kind of have a combination. One of the hallmarks of places where bullying happens more often is disrespect of the adults for the children, or disrespect more generally of people for each other, including the adults. So there's this weird idea that, there would be less bullying if only the teachers and the parents would be more strict. Often that strictness gets translated into its own kind of bullying. Often the bullies themselves have been bullied by their parents or by other siblings or by other people. And so one of the ways you do this is by modeling kind behavior. This is a high ask, right? As a solution, it's very hard to sell this to a school administrator. You need to be nicer to your students, right? I'm already nice to my students. I love my students, right? But the idea that there might be some fault of the culture that allows for bullying, that encourages it, that certainly plays with it in the context of intramural sports and things like that, where cruelness is not always, especially among boys, is not always seen as a terrible thing. So that is probably the largest solution to cyberbullying, but also the most difficult one to achieve. At kind of the meso level, in between here, is a bureaucratic solution, which is to say that you need to have spaces, you need to have processes by which victims of bullying and people who are not victims of bullying, even people who are engaging in bullying, where they have a way to talk to someone about it, and if that doesn't work, where they have a way to report it and have meaningful action be taken about that reporting. There's a strong parallel here to issues around sexual harassment. Sexual harassment was laughed off for a long time. It's boys being boys, right? And even today, of course, it's still often laughed off. But in organizations where they have had a solution, the solution is to have very clear and explicit guidelines for how it's reported and how it's adjudicated, and then have serious repercussions for violating policies around sexual harassment. So some of it's not just be nice to each other, but having a clear policy that says what constitutes bullying, what happens when you see it, either as a victim, a perpetrator, or someone on the sidelines, and how you report that. As I said, the technologies provide us an opportunity to provide evidence of this kind of thing. And so just as you have to accumulate evidence when you're making a case around sexual harassment, bullying more broadly now can be brought forward with evidence of that bullying. And the last piece is, we need to think about the social platforms and the technological affordances that allow bullying to happen or encourage it in some way. I mean, the obvious case here is something like Yik Yak, although that tended to be more at the university level, college level, than it did in the high school and younger level. Yik Yak allowed people to be very, very much anonymous, and so this allowed them to attack individuals without giving away who they were themselves. This is also true of Ask Me, which is much more popular with younger people, where you can ask questions anonymously of a user. And so you'd think those would be the main channels for bullying, and you'd probably think something like Snapchat or anywhere where you could make the evidence disappear would likewise be a place where bullying happens. And you'd be right in both those cases. The affordances around these technologies encourage I don't know if they encourage them, but they certainly enable bullying to a great extent. But by far, if you ask both younger people and people who are a bit older, where do they get bullied? It's not there, but on Instagram. That the visual medium that encourages things like selfies also encourages, invites bullying. And sometimes it's an explicit invitation to bully. I mean, if you go online and you say rate me, which is not that uncommon as a hashtag, if you go and search Instagram for rate me, you'll still see that, asking people to rate your appearance. That kind of vulnerability invites bullying in many cases. So often when they've done surveys now, and they've talked to kids about how they're being bullied. Instagram is very popular as a platform, but it's also popular as a platform for bullying. So you need to think about the design of these platforms so that you're discouraging those kinds of activities. In the worst case, you can say, as many campuses did with Yik Yak, that we don't accept this because it's a sort of a noxious, a toxic environment for interaction. And so from the educational perspective, we'd rather you didn't use it. There's the Barbra Streisand effect, which makes it hard to shut down any sort of system or structure. But frankly, Yik Yak kind of died once people realized that it wasn't very useful, and that it didn't integrate very well with other social networks. So if you really are looking for a solution, it needs to be a combination of all three of those levels. You need a cultural solution, you need this institutional solution, processes, organizations that are there to support on the one hand and adjudicate and punish on the other. And then you need to think about the technological affordances. Is there a way that can work with these other levels, right? Is there a way that you can encourage kindness through the interface? Is there a way that you can, some of this is a question of do you need to have downvotes? So, there are places that Facebook has upvotes, but not so much downvotes. You can be angry as a react, but Reddit, you can downvote things. Does downvoting things make it better? Instagram only has the love, right? You can only have the love. So maybe little things like that, little choices that encourage kindness over viciousness can be helpful. And if you can interact with the meso level, with the institutions for reporting, you should have a way to accumulate evidence and be able to report that when it's happening. Many of the people in the technological world are all about detecting this in real time, right? Having cyberbullying detection algorithms that can recognize patterns and alert the appropriate people when bullying appears to be happening. Honestly, that's not a bad idea. It's something that can be done, but I would not put all of my eggs in that basket. And particularly if that is not done without support from the culture and from the institutions, it's not going to have any effect at all. So all of these things have to work in concert. What if we don't tackle this problem? The worst, people are jerks in crowds, especially anonymous crowds. People get a little bit crazy. This is something we've known for a very long time. That people behaving badly often infect others around them with that bad behavior, especially when it's a relatively anonymous crowd. We haven't had the kind of mad crowds, the vengeful crowds happening very often. We see them in war. We see them in places like Libya afterwards when the people kind of take vengeance on the leadership. We've seen it in a number of places, but we haven't, mostly when we think about these kinds of mob justice and crazy mobs, most of that it seems like it comes from fiction or history. But in the worst case, these technologies can encourage that. And we've seen the edge of this, where people have engaged in sort of crowdsourcing investigation, and then that crowdsourced investigation then turns into crowdsourced punishment. And so, you know, in the case of the Boston bomber, where people on Reddit misidentified the perpetrator and then kind of went after him and his family, and there have been other cases where they've misidentified someone, or somehow identified the wrong person and doxed them and gone after them. This is a real danger, and it's happened in a number of places, both in the United States and outside of the United States, and has been enabled by some of the technologies that people use online. So if we don't solve, and we have to solve the bullying problem anyway, because we should have solved it before it was cyberbullying. Now that it is cyberbullying, it is exacerbated, and we also have some new means for attacking it. So we have to solve that problem. But if we don't, then it becomes this much worse problem of mob justice, of bullying on a much larger scale, of cultural acceptance of bullying. And really, you know, cultural acceptance of bullying is almost the definition of fascism. So if we can't solve this in the schools, if we can't solve this at the small scale, if we can't solve this at work, you know, for adults, if we can't reduce bullying through cultural, procedural, and technological changes, then we're going to put ourselves in a lot of hurt. And I don't think that, unlike some other complaints about technology, this is one particular case where I think we can identify it as a very serious problem, and one that deserves a lot more attention than it's getting right now.